Wait a minute and try. Okay, we're live. Okay, cool. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest, a very interesting book I read through, finished it yesterday. Title of the book is Surviving Communist Chinese Detention. And his name is Steven Schaerer. His last name is spelled Schaerer. Book was published May 2021. And he goes into detail about what it's really like kind of being on the inside of the CCP's China, what they call the Middle Kingdom. And so he has a lot of insight. He speaks fluent Mandarin and has spent time there. But he, like the title says, had a very unfortunate event. So he can talk more about that. So Steven Schaerer, are you there?
Hey, William, it's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you very much for the invitation and taking some time to learn a little bit more about my story.
Yeah, no, really incredible, fascinating, harrowing, kind of reminded me of some other like nightmare jail stories or videos or a Turkish prison or something like that. But for people who may not have heard your background, this is your first book, is my understanding. Can you talk about your background and what led you to China and led you to write this book?
Sure. Yeah. So, like to start at the beginning. Born and raised in California, that's home for me. What I did prior to landing in China was I was, pursuing my degree in chemistry at Sonoma State University, so kind of like the North Bay area. And so I graduated, and the initial trajectory was, hey, go get a PhD in OChem or something like that. But it wasn't really where my passion lied. So I thought about things, and for a litany of different reasons, China kind of haphazardly fell into place. So I did my due diligence. I, kind of just, put two and two together, went to the embassy, got the visa. I was already sponsored. I had a company that was, had hired me to do English teaching. And at the time, really the kind of crux of the decision was, hey, I get to do more traveling, which I love to do, get to see a new part of the world that's different. I'd not been to Asia before. And I get to, learn a new language and pay off student debt and get paid. So it was kind of like tick, tick, tick across the board. It made a lot of sense back then. And that was really the extent of what I knew or thought or understood. So yes, there were some people who kind of approached me far wiser and knew more and more life experience. And they were like, hey, why would you go to China? That's a communist country. But at the time I was like a 21, 22-year-old, didn't really put two and two together. I understood it theoretically, but I didn't have any real life experience with communism, authoritarian states. So I heeded the warning to a degree in my mind. The back of my mind, I was like, oh, okay, be careful. But I had traveled all over the world. I hold multiple passports. I have two immigrant parents. My dad's from Switzerland originally. My mom's from Mexico. So I've been through Europe. I've been through Latin America, North America. Been there, done that. And so to me, it was just a new adventure. It was just a fun thing to do. And so I ended up hopping on that one-way flight to Beijing, took that job offer, initially teaching English for about 2 years as I studied Mandarin. As my Mandarin improved, that turned into new opportunities, ultimately ended up with me and some Chinese partners co-founding an educational consulting company in Beijing, which recently the Chinese government has kind of closed that entire industry down at a nationwide level, if you've been following the news on that. But yeah, that was a very kind of lucrative market back in the day. It was one of the few markets that, quote unquote, foreigners, as we are referred to on Chinese soil, Lao Wai or Wai, which translates into foreigner. If you're not Chinese, that's kind of the distinction. You're just called a foreigner on the subway restaurants. That's just what you're referred to. Culture there. So basically, I ran this company. We were profitable, we were successful. There's a lot of industries that you can't operate in as a foreigner in China due to national security issues and a lot of other laws. But yeah, and
that's, sorry to interrupt, but that's the most favored second language is English, right? So every parent wants their kid to learn American English, I assume. Is that correct?
Yeah, was a huge industry before the government literally took it down last month. But more so than I've seen it adopted in any other country country. Sure, you can make the argument, hey, English is the lingua franca, it's the global language, everyone learns it. But in China, more so. In China, it was really kind of representative of your status, your education. It was just as important to a degree as your job title. Like, could you speak English? And so what you had, and it's hard to kind of, explain and picture that and convey what that looked like as an industry here in America. But imagine that throughout every city in America, Miami, LA, New York, there were a multitude of different Chinese learning centers for adults, kids, everything scattered throughout every city, every block, every area. And at the end of the day, you had every adult, lawyers, Fortune 500 professionals, doctors, accountants flooding into these, let's call them Chinese learning centers after work to improve their Chinese. That's what English is like in China. So you had these companies scattered everywhere, desperately seeking to hire, foreign native English speakers to train the population. So I was actually teaching adult English learners myself in these language kind of training centers for the first 2 years of my experience in China.
Right. And what was your experience like in those first 2 years? How did you adapt? What roughly time frame were we talking about? And what was it like being an outsider there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's a bit of on one end of the spectrum. So I worked in, it was 2011, the beginning of 2012 is when I moved to China. So I landed there kind of like January, February of 2012. And then ultimately was not detained until the tail end of 2016, around October. I think it was the end of October. And so ultimately spanning about 5 years. Worked for about 2 years in that English teaching capacity, and then moved to that educational consulting company after that. So about 2 years, give or take there. It was an interesting experience. No slight against the Chinese population. They're kind of stuck under the thumb of an authoritarian regime. They are well aware if you question the system, if you dissent, if you do anything outside of what you're allowed to do as a citizen, you are going to disappear, or there will be consequences in some iteration of that. So for me as a quote unquote foreigner in China, one of the first kind of eye-opening things was Taiwan came up in a couple conversations just haphazardly, because if you're an American, people are interested. Oftentimes you're the first foreigner or the first American that a lot of the kind of domestic Chinese population is fed. So Taiwan came up in a couple conversations. It was like month 2 for me. And I'm, I understand the basics of it, but I don't, understand the intricacies of it. And so it was interesting. Someone asked me, like, well, what is the U.S. position? Does it see Taiwan as an independent country or something like that? To which I responded something like, yeah, I think it's an independent country, not understanding the ramifications and the implications of that. And someone came up to me after the fact and said, hey, we don't talk about that here. And I was like, what is that? And they're like, well, they alerted me to the 3 T's, as most foreigners who've worked in China are familiar with, which is Taiwan, Tibet, and Tiananmen Square. You don't really talk about the 3 T's. And so that was my kind of introduction into some of the sensitivities that exist in the Chinese kind of market as a quote unquote foreigner. So on the whole, the Chinese people were very hospitable, warm, kind. Politics was not really brought up because even the most common thing you hear from a Chinese national under this repressive authoritarian kind of communist state is we don't talk about politics. We don't, need to even worry about it. The government, which they refer to as the quote unquote black box, that's something that they deal with. We don't know what happens in the black box. Politicians deal with that, not us. We just live our simple lives. We work, we have a family, and we don't question. We just kind of follow whatever we're told to do. Sometimes there's new laws and you just follow those new laws, and that's it. And so the average Chinese person, pretty hospitable, very welcoming, very kind, but they are, suffering under the very authoritarian and iron fist of the Communist Party in China.
And what was it like there when you were working? I mean, did you have restrictions on access to the internet, information? And it's kind of I don't know what state Beijing was where you were, But I mean, still the technology and the growth of the development of China at least has developed technologically, but still they may not have, the environmental laws may not have followed along with the advancement.
Yeah, so Western influence is seen as a threat, like just pure outright. And we can start with the education minister, the ex-education minister, Yuan Guiren, who I believe was the 16th education minister for the country, who has a very famous quote. And it's something to the effect of, we must never use foreign textbooks. Western ideals shall not permeate into our classrooms. We must adopt socialist principles and socialist characteristics. The West essentially is seen as a threat, and this is mirrored and echoed throughout a multitude of CCP speeches, literature. Xi Jinping has, himself has echoed these sentiments. So there is a concerted effort to minimize Western influence, right? You and I, in the eyes of the Chinese government, are not supposed to exist. They have sold 1.5 billion people with the idea, our authoritarian way is the way. That is the only way. You do not elect your leaders. You do not follow democracy. You don't need any of that Western nonsense or like religion or God or open free societies or democracy. You don't need that. That's wrong. What you need is communism. What you need is socialism. What you need is Maoism with all this nonsense.
Right. It's also ironic because Mao actually, when he was coming up, he was reading philosophy from the West. And I mean, even Marxism is kind of definitely something that comes out of Europe. So it's kind of still silly and ironic that they would try to censor all that stuff that all these guys who started the communist country there did.
Exactly. There's lots of irony in the Communist Party. But yeah, exactly. But so what you get then from that ideology at the kind of head of state, this, there shall not be any Western influence. The West is evil and bad, and religion is stupid and all this other stuff, is you get a society that is completely locked in. In China, you have no access to foreign platforms. There is no Facebook, there is no YouTube, there is no Google, there is no Twitter, there is none of that. It does not exist. It's not allowed to exist. You see a Western quote unquote movie, the few that they even allow into the country, it's heavily moderated, heavily censored. I remember seeing quote unquote Western movies in China, and then people would I would talk about them with Americans back home, and they would be talking about certain scenes, and I'm like, I didn't even see that was in the movie, failing to recognize that entire chunks of the movie that I saw had been completely wiped and segregated out or cut from the movie. They were literally seeing a different movie than the one that I saw. There were just happened to be some overlap. So everything is blocked, banned. They have Chinese equivalents, which are heavily monitored. And again, they are super censored. You cannot, post a litany of different things. You are tracked, you're monitored. And this kind of now we're tying into the social credit score and that whole thing where there's basically a quantified, you as an individual are quantified. There's a number assigned to your existence, and that number is either good or bad. And if it's good, cool, you're fine. If it's bad, all of a sudden you have a higher interest rate on your mortgage than your neighbor. If it's bad, you can, if you go visit a city, you can only stay at 4-star hotels or 3-star hotels. You're banned from 5-star hotels. You now can no longer travel by rail or air. And that's if you're lucky. If it drops too low, you're going to disappear and end up in the same black site prison cells that I ended up in.
Wow. So, I mean, it's really incredible. So that was happening when you were in China, all that. And did you find Beijing to be cosmopolitan, or were you kind of really, as a foreigner, were you in a super minority? Because like in New York or LA, it's multi-ethnic, super multicultural. What was your impression being on the inside there?
So China's stuck between a rock and a hard place from a system of governance. On one end of the spectrum, they're very concerned with the system or the concept of face, right? And so what they want to be able to do is say, hey, look, we're just as developed, we're just as international, we're just as cosmopolitan as all of those other big cities, those developed countries, LA, New York, Singapore, Tokyo, London. So what they do is they have to allow quote unquote foreigners into the country to some extent, right? They have to be able to say, hey, look, we have the same, kind of international community that you can find in Shanghai or Beijing or Shenzhen or whatever. So it is cosmopolitan to a degree. And in fact, it's funny you say that when one of my best friends, from Canada, a lot of people from California come visit. And one of my best friends, when he was there and we'd gone through Beijing and gone through Shanghai, he's like, it's really interesting the way they've designed these cities. And I was like, what do you mean by that? He's like, it's kind of like Manhattan and Leningrad made a baby. And you get this like weird, like it's cosmopolitan here, but then it's like kind of the slums over there. And you get this weird mishmash of like a city. It's very interesting. You can see the communist roots, but this also kind of attempt at modernization through capitalism. But yeah, it's just a very interesting and kind of fascinating place. And so you have this kind of mixture of the two.
So, but I mean, do you still get kind of like this, lots of foreigners, as you say, or they get the word? I mean, can you talk about the business environment and what it was like? Because a lot of people they would just assume everything functions like it does in the US or Europe.
Yeah, and that kind of segues into that. So China has to have foreigners there, right, to meet that parity, to say, hey, we're just as good as the West. We can have foreigners here too and have this international community. The problem, though, is, and I refer to the time that I got there as the golden era of going to China. This was post 2008. This is when the world was kind of opening up to China and modernizing it. The Olympics had just kind of concluded. So there was this kind of like feel good, like China was opening up, it was expanding, and they had kind of sold a lot of people on that. So you had this influx of foreigners. There was a lot of like kind of fun, international vibes. There were other foreigners there as well. It was very international. It was very diverse. And that was like 2012, 2013. And then slowly you started to see the authoritarian kind of sentiment moving in. You started to see the changes, the discussion of a social credit system. I remember when they started to lay it out for what it would look like for foreigners, the way that they would be scored, we would be scored, and you would be assigned kind of a point system based on your experience and professionalism and all this other stuff, and you'd be classified under like a different letter to say like, what type of professional you are. And you could see the sentiment changing, and you felt it because you started to see this kind of clamped down environment became more authoritarian. It became there were just kind of like little bits and pieces of things that were changing. Then you started to feel like there were fewer and fewer foreigners. People started to kind of move abroad. You started to hear stories of bad things happening, deportation machines, etc. It was not directly visible, but you could kind of sense a shift. And so for me, running a business out there with my Chinese partners was, again, in the industries you're allowed to operate in. So for example, you will never ever see a foreign telecom company. It's going to be the 3 Chinese telecom companies forever because of national security. It's going to be China Unicom, China Mobile, and China Telecom. Those are the only 3. It will only be Chinese state-owned enterprises. So one of the places where foreigners were kind of allowed to dabble was, at least traditionally, in the education sector. For a lot of different reasons, it was just kind of one of the most viable paths in. And so the company that I ran was pretty straightforward. We were running educational consulting services. So again, with this very heavily centralized, focused push into the education sector for adults to learn English, back then at least, we were just in the right place at the right time, had the right networks through our clients. And so we had everything from Fortune 500 clients where we were a vendor to working with some of the local training centers to provide these kind of training services to adult English language learners in China. So it was everything from marketing to tailoring classes to a lot of different things.
And did you find that your Chinese partners, they were the ones who were kind of familiar with the business practices of China, trying to, you call it guanxi, or relationships, like the sensibilities, I suspect, or would you say that the sensibility, you had to kind of adapt to Chinese sensibilities?
100%. Yeah, you have to do business their way. One of the best ways to even answer that question is that as a foreigner, it is possible to run a what's called a WOFE, or a wholly owned foreign enterprise, it is much more difficult to do that. You have to go through a more extensive list of scrutiny. You have to have a much higher amount of money to put down. You are going to be kind of scrutinized left, right, and center. It's much more difficult as a foreigner to own your own company in China. Is it possible? Yes. Can you do it? Definitely. But if you partner with the Chinese, it is much more straightforward. There's far less scrutiny. They're trusted, so to speak, by the government. It's less likely in their eyes that a Chinese person would do something bad against the country or the state, or social stability, or whatever the thing is. So oftentimes that's the most viable option. It's less money, it's less time intensive. It's a much more straightforward, streamlined process if you are working with Chinese partners. And so that's kind of the most effective medium then to run a business, which is just to partner with the Chinese. Also then, for incorporation procedures and tax document, tax issues that come up, and all the other things that you're dealing with the kind of bureaucratic communist system, and you have to be able to know which department to go to, what part of the city. It's helpful to have a Chinese partner as opposed to having to kind of do all of that yourself. So it's almost necessary.
Right. So when you had these partners, what led to you had to go through, you said you had all the proper documentation, visas. How did you run afoul of their legal system?
Yeah, so I was on the receiving end of a police raid, and it's not what we kind of think about in movies. It's not like people, a group of officers come in guns blazing or something like that. In fact, it's quite common. And if you have worked or spoken with anyone who has lived and worked in China for an extended period of time, they have seen some iteration of this. So whether it was, CCP authorities coming into the building that I worked in, years past, where they would, they would come around and, check on all the foreigners, and, require the building itself, management, to keep a list of all the foreigners, make sure they have the right documents and paperwork just to keep an eye on you. They have, monitors that are assigned to you through the PSB, the Public Security Bureau, which basically just monitors foreigners. To watch them, they will, you don't know that it's happening, but you know that it exists. They will, kind of check up on different foreigners throughout the week or throughout the month. They won't come talk to you, but they will, kind of make sure you're doing what you're supposed to be doing and working as you're supposed to be working, and all this other stuff. So you're monitored as a foreigner. And again, this ties into the social credit system, that whole kind of, thing. But there is this distrust of foreigners in the country. Which stems from the education system, which stems from the government, which stems from this attempt to create this very, harmonious society. And where China's stuck between a rock and a hard place is you have this influx of foreigners. But what do you do with a foreigner that, becomes, fluent in Mandarin, has a presence, is popular, and maybe doesn't agree with the Chinese government? How do you handle that foreigner, right? And that's where they're stuck. They want, on one end of the spectrum, to say, hey, we welcome the world and the international community, but they can't do to me as an American citizen what they can do to Chinese nationals, where there is no, consequence there. To me, hey, he has a foreign government going to bat for him, and not just a foreign government, a powerful one. And that's where, PR and face and a lot of these things kind of come into place. The big question for the CCP is, how do you handle foreigners, right? Now, all of a sudden you have a foreigner that's married to a Chinese national. They have kids together. What do you do if they dissent? What do you do if they don't agree with the party? What do you do? And so that's where they're kind of stuck. And I think at the end of the day, what they did with me was kind of, it was a test run. It was, hey, so there was this police raid. It was, not guns blazing or anything. Just a group of officers who came into the police, into the office. And we had seen this before. This is not uncommon. Anyone who's worked in China has seen an iteration of this. Foreigners are monitored. It just is what it is. And they ask you questions. And so they asked us a bunch of questions, who do you know? How long have you been here? What do you do, et cetera? And so where we thought things were getting strange, it was a group of us, and we just had a kind of shared office. I was not working with them under the same company, but there was a German national and Spanish national there as well. They asked all of us to come into the police office in the morning. And that's where we thought things were strange, because usually it's just they come into the office, they ask a few questions, they'll maybe shake down the company. There's a lot of bribery issues in China from the government and corruption. And that's kind of it. And then on they go to the next victim. Here, this was different. They said, hey, we need you to come to the police station tomorrow, answer questions. And that's where we started to get jitter, and we knew that something was off. We knew this is not standard procedure. What's happening? So I think this was some kind of test run of, hey, can we do this to foreigners? Can we do this to an American? What will the backlash be? Will there be any kind of consequences? And that's kind of where things started.
And so what happened next when they asked you to come back into the police bureau? What you were anticipating, just more questioning, right?
Right. So we went through we were separated, hours of interrogation. I brought all of my visa documents, my visa, my alien permit, I don't work visa, tax documentation, incorporation papers, police registration, all these things you're required to get if you work in China, legally at least. And so I was not really concerned. I was like, I have every legal document I need. I've been here for years. I speak the language. I know what's going on. And so basically hours of interrogation. At the end of it, they basically force you to sign confession documents. Now, you don't know it's a confession document. It's like pages and pages in Mandarin. You're not given time to read it. They're like, sign, fingerprint, all of this. This is what we just talked about.
No attorney, right? No representation.
No. And that was a large impetus behind the book, because when I came back to the States and spoke to people in North America or in Europe, there's just no point of reference. They think they're so used to the system here. They're like, oh, there must be Miranda rights, there must be bail, there must be a phone call, a lawyer, a day in court, due process. They fail to recognize that this is a country that routinely detains, tortures, and executes human rights attorneys of all people. That does not exist. You get an attorney, it's not going to help you. They don't care. It's a government decision. It's not a legal decision. And so
it's very important. Americans are very naive about, generally the ones I've spoken to take it for granted in a lot of ways being brought up in the system. You're just used to it and you expect it, which is good. But a lot of people are naive about how other places operate, not just China too.
Yeah, we're very fortunate here. We are very, very fortunate to have the system that we have, and hopefully to protect it and preserve it. Because once you go the way of China, look, China is listed by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch as the country that kills and executes more of its own citizens every single year, to the tune of thousands of individuals than the rest of the world combined. That's an amazing statistic, right? And that's worth repeating. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, China executes more of its own citizenry than the rest of the world combined. That includes the leading executioners, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan. That includes countries with equal population, India, Russia, the United States. Every country combined does not even remotely stack up to the number of executions that still take place in China every single year. So it's always ironic here in the States when I hear people talk about Asian hate or something like that. And I'm like, why is no one talking about China? China is executing people, Asians specifically, left, right, and center every day, and it's unaddressed. It's not covered. No one discusses it. It's just business as usual, and all of our companies are doing
right. There you go. That's really what it is. That's really.
Oh, it is. It's stunning to me. Yeah. It's absolutely fascinating, and that's on top of we're glossing over slave labor, we're glossing over child labor, we're glossing over rights violations.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Christians, the full spectrum.
Falun Gong.
Every one of them. Yeah. So we sign these confession documents, and it's not, it's not a question. It's not like, please, sir, like, will you sign? You sign and you fingerprint. And it's literally to the point where they will grab, if you disagree, they'll just grab your hand and start forcing you to, do this. So there's no phone call, there's no discussion or deliberation or, a lawyer, any of that stuff. You're just forced to sign these. And then they say, okay, look, come back tomorrow, you'll get your passport and you can go home. That's it. So we come back the next day, go back into the police station, and that's when things got weird. That's when this, kind of prison transport vehicle popped up through the window. When we were waiting, we were told, hey, come get your visas or your passports. That did not happen. Instead, there was a prison transport vehicle waiting for us. And that was day one of detention. You're just told to get into the cage in the back of the kind of prison vehicle you go. And that was the start of day one of being carted around from holding facilities to weird medical testing to processing centers, ultimately landing in a black site prison compound in the middle of nowhere.
It's just incredible. I mean, it's really kind of right out of 1984. All of your descriptions and everything you talked about was just like somebody got into room 101. Like, they don't tell you anything. I mean, you can talk about all the stuff you were deprived of. I mean, can you tell about what happened next?
Yeah, so without getting too lost in the weeds, everything you have is stripped from you. You are, you forced to undergo weird medical testing. At the end of the day, you're not fed, you're not, drinking anything. Your blood is drawn, your face is shoved into an iris scanner. You go through a series of weird medical testing before you're brought to this black site prison facility. And this is, a massive industrial complex. There's armed guards on the perimeter. This is not some rinky-dink detention center. This is a full-scale military prison system. And so you're carted into it. You're brought to one area that you're stripped down naked. You're marched through metal detectors. All your belongings are taken, pushed into it like some other room in a bag. You're thrown into prison garb, you're handed some kind of blood-stained blankets, and then you're marched into the prison wing, essentially, which is a large corridor full of just jail cells, closed, barred doors. And so I was pushed into essentially the first one, and we were separated. It was, myself, a German colleague, and a Spanish colleague, separated into different cells. And so you are locked up in a prison cell. There were 17 inmates in my prison cell. Way overcramped. You sleep on, cold wooden planks with your little blood-stained blanket. There's fluorescent beams kind of shooting down on you 24 hours a day. These things never turn off. So you can't sleep. You're forcibly sleep deprived, which is a horrific thing to do to a human being. It's your brain literally, the studies show your brain starts to atrophy. It literally can kill you, put you into a comatose state. So sleep deprivation, which is one of the most misunderstood concepts on the world, is horrifically destructive. You're sharing a single squatter toilet. You are eating, they pour some sludge through a funnel into a bucket that the 17 inmates share. You eat out of this kind of communal trough. You're malnourished within days. I couldn't even eat it and I had eaten everything. I lived in China for 5 years. I've had, tried all the different organs and crickets and bugs. So I've been there. I'm not like some picky eater, but this was so bad. It was so much worse than that you could not physically eat it. It's disgusting. But you get to a point where it's like, well, you're either going to starve and die, or you eat the sludge out of the bucket. So, I ate the sludge out of the bucket, and at some point you just get there. You're so hungry. And so then you're malnourished, you're sleep deprived, and we're glossing over the violence, the suicide warning signs on the walls. These conditions are designed to kill people, straight and simple. It's that easy to say. They are horrific. And so I was routinely pulled out of my prison cell by guards, which is not a good place to be in the first instance, to translate for foreign inmates who are on hunger strike. So these are big, strong, grown men from different countries. And so they are, no one speaks English on top of all this. Listen to the cards, my cell was about 13 Chinese inmates. It was myself, and then individuals from several African countries, Pakistan and India, ultimately. And so I was pulled out of my cell, brought to other cells where foreign inmates had stopped eating. And in some cases, they couldn't communicate. They didn't speak Mandarin. They did not know why they were detained. They had no access to their embassy. So you're shut off from the entire world under these horrific conditions. So people stop eating within days. And so I'm brought by guards, and they point to, inmate X, and they're like, hey, make him eat. And so your job now is to go up to inmate X and say, and try and make him eat. And that's a hell of a position to be in ever, to try and talk to someone who's so lost, so gone, that they have refused to consume food any longer. I mean, imagine what it takes to put someone in that state. That's usually the best part of your day. You look forward to that. When you get to a place where you're like, I'd rather starve to death than continue to be here, it's a hell of an environment to be in. So things like that. And then there's the violence and the lack of any type of psychological care or system for individuals who are mentally unstable, of which there are many they just kind of throw everyone into these prison cells. So you're dealing with life or death on a pretty daily basis. It's a very erratic, unstable, volatile. I mean, and I, as the only inmate that could speak English and Mandarin in my cell for a period of time at least, often was defaulted to the translator against my will, preventing fights, preventing people who wanted to kill each other. I mean, it's a very, very dangerous environment. And on top of that, arguably the worst two variables are that A, you're held incommunicado, meaning you have no contact with the outside world. You're not allowed, you're told it's illegal to contact your embassy. Luckily, I contacted them en route to the detention facility. And so consular officers ultimately were dispatched to the prison facility on 2 separate occasions. And the second variable that sucks is you're essentially held indefinitely. You don't know when or if you're going to get out. So my first day was month 2 or 2.5 for one of the other inmates in my cell. And he was so gone, he was literally just rocking back and forth in a corner, singing to himself. He couldn't speak Mandarin. He couldn't communicate with anyone there. So you can imagine what these conditions do to you, on top of then not being able to speak the language and talk to anyone. So they're horrific, they're dangerous, they're violent. No one cares if you live or die. This is a country that routinely, the government, harvests human organs and then sells them on the black market. There's no human rights. There's no ethical, moral.
No habeas corpus, nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing from the Magna Carta. So all of these kind of legal things that have grown up to have power against the state through the Bill of Rights and everything like that, which you mentioned in your book, it does not exist in China. So
Nothing.
People need to realize, and I think you even emphasize like there's intentional ambiguity. So like you have no idea, like, oh, what are you going to do next? So the psychological stuff that they can pull on their own citizens and you're lucky you're a American, but it's unbelievable there in China. I mean, people don't understand what happens if you cross the line, and it's probably like that in all communist systems. Actually,
exactly.
Don't have a functional liberal legal system.
Right, and it's ambiguous by design. What is it they routinely detain people for? Destabilizing social harmony or destabilizing state security. What does that really mean? No one understands that. It's all ambiguous by nature.
It's intentional, right? It's intentional, so they can just do whatever they want. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So ultimately, I was in this psychotic system, enduring near-death circumstances for about a month before I was ultimately deported back to California, back to San Francisco, where I arrived half dead. Glossing over the PTSD, there was the malnutrition, there was the sleep deprivation, there was, probable neurological damage, et cetera. So there was a lot of issues there at play. And so, I kind of had 2 paths at that point. It was like either you stay silent and just move on with life and do nothing, or you kind of go to bat, go to war, and advocate your story. You take ownership of it. And I chose the latter as opposed to the former. I wrote this book. It ended up, hitting #1 under human rights, outselling Ben Shapiro of all people, overtaking his book on Amazon for a brief period of time at least. And it is just such a novel, unique, important message. It's pertinent, it's relevant. This is our #1 adversary. This is a government that routinely talks about the need to kill American citizens, threatens to nuke us, and has been doing this for decades. It's extensively documented CCP literature. Whether you're reading Unrestricted Warfare, whether you're looking at speeches by Chi Haotian, who's the mastermind behind the Tiananmen Square massacre, which was a pro-democracy movement where they murdered thousands of Chinese college students in front of Tiananmen Square, who has talked about the need to kill 1 to 200 million Americans to secure a Chinese-led century. Whether you're listening to Xi Jinping talk about how America is the great evil in the world and the #1 source of chaos, and telling the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, to prepare for war against us.
But he sends his kids here to school at Harvard, right? But still.
And his daughter studied at Harvard. So these people have a strong dislike for us, but more than a dislike, we are an existential threat to them. And so I often remind Americans, your existence as a democratically run, religiously oriented, God first country, state, city, individual, whatever it happens to be, you're not supposed to exist in the eyes of the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese state. Why? Because they have sold this authoritarian system of slave labor and death camps to their populace. Hey, just trust us, we'll make you rich. you won't have a voice, you'll have no human rights, you'll have no democracy, you don't get to pick your leaders. But as long as we retain power, we'll make you wealthy, and that's all that matters. And so they then look at us and the West and the UK and Germany and the United States and Canada and Australia as very peculiar and a threat, because, hey, why do they get to pick their leaders? Why do they believe in a God? Why do they have religion and Christianity and open, religious practicing?
Free speech.
Free speech. Gun ownership is another one. Why do they get that? And by the way, that should not exist. That they should not, according to what we've been taught here in China, and in this one-party system and all this stuff, they should be a failure, but they're not. They're more successful than we are. Why is that? Why are their salaries so high? Why is their home value so high? Why are they better off than this promised system of deliverance and wealth? And that is a huge problem. So when you understand it from that perspective, a lot of what you're seeing today, the US has to be demonized. It has to be mocked. It has to be ridiculed. Our system has to look like a joke, like it's messy, unorganized, unstructured, in order for this kind of communist system of governance to permeate globally and to be a new order of sorts, a new world order, as we all hear about so often. In order for that to make sense and for that to be sold, China has to defeat COVID easily, right? Look at the messy Western systems. They can't even, figure out what they're doing. Look at all those people dying from gunshots, in the United States. It's weird. It's the Wild West. It's crazy. It's haphazard. Look at China, but people then fail to realize, then they look at China. And if you're familiar with China, you have to have an ID and you have to be, kind of almost licensed essentially to buy a kitchen knife. Why do you have to have an ID to buy a kitchen knife? Because even though guns are banned in China, so many mass stabbings occur in China all the time that they have to literally restrict kitchen knives at this point, because so many people are killed and injured every single year in China from kitchen knives. So you can restrict guns and get rid of them, and it really won't change human nature. You still have a very kind of pent up, angry populace in China, because there is no recourse, there is no human rights, there is no system of justice,
no redress, right? No, nothing.
Exactly.
So now you've been out of there for a while. I mean, you're kind of you've written this book. Are you engaged in other activism, just trying to educate people about the realities of China? I mean, you kind of invested there. All that time invested there is lost too, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So on top of just being happy to come home alive and returning to the United States half dead, and look, this is something that kills America. Familiar with the name Otto Warmbier, North Korea. Look, there's currently Americans, Canadians on death row in China. This is a very glossing over the detention and the arbitrary detention, being held incommunicado. This is something that affects Westerners directly. This is life or death. This is not some kind of whatever. So a large impetus behind the book was what I realized is I had to kind of educate Americans from the, hey, why didn't you get an attorney? Oh, because they usually detain, torture, and execute them. We just did not have, back in 2016 when I was first released, there was no point of reference. The media kind of has caught up. It's kind of exposed China. Surprisingly, in certain instances on both ends of the political spectrum, there is this kind of awakening to the threat that China poses. And so people now are much more better positioned to understand the book, what I talk about. It's why I don't even in the book dive straight into the story. I spend the first few chapters talking about Marx, communism, China structurally from a system of governance, how it works running a business, in the hopes that I can provide a framework for people to then understand the story. Because if I dive straight into the story, the point of reference for most Americans or Westerners is just China, the US or Europe. They don't understand all the kind of, intricate details of the system of, the judicial system and all the other stuff that exists over there, or lack thereof. So a large part of my advocacy now is, doing interviews, sharing my book, talking about my story. I speak to the different government offices, governors, senators, congressional task forces, the U.S. Department of State, military intelligence, the full spectrum, saying, hey, this is a threat. U.S. interests, U.S. citizens are not being protected abroad. we need to do much more to be proactive about how we can protect U.S. interests abroad and advocate for the rights of U.S. citizens and to warn them about the realities of what can come should you choose to go to one of these countries, be it North Korea, be it Iran, Syria, China, the full spectrum. Dangerous things often can and do happen, and those stories need to be heard. So that's a large part of what I do these days, really to kind of warn individuals who may be considering these jurisdictions as a place to travel or visit or work.
Or invest, right. Where's the best place for people to find the book, Surviving Chinese Communist Detention?
Yeah, it really depends on purchasing preferences. It's everywhere. It's on Amazon. It's on Walmart, Target, Barnes & Noble, Apple, the full spectrum. It's on Kindle. It's on the Nook. You can get the hardcover, paperback. They're available pretty much everywhere. Again, it's Surviving Chinese Communist Detention. Just a very powerful, important story and one that's very timely, relevant, and pertinent. And it kind of sinks into the broader ethos of what's happening geopolitically currently.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree 100%. And where's your social media? Where can people reach out to? Do you have a website?
Yeah, so I do. I have ChineseCommunistDetention.com. That's a place where I kind of blog about some Chinese issues. I'm also on Gab. Just search my name, Steven Schaerer. I've been blocked and censored by Facebook, and not super surprising. When I was working in Beijing, Mark Zuckerberg would come out every year or so, and he would kind of do his awkward little smog jog photo ops in front of Tiananmen Square. Which every local foreigner was like, why is he running around Tiananmen Square in the smog? And then he would go meet with Li Keqiang or, some premier or CCP official begging for market access for Facebook. So, what's the downstream reality of that? Now, Americans who survive communist detention like myself are blocked and censored off of platforms like Facebook, where I can't even create a profile, an author page, or a book, a page to share, what I've been through. So, kind of relegated to the remnants of free speech online, which are platforms like Gab.
Right. No, that's, incredible. And I think people have to really be attuned to possible censorship here that's coming from somewhere outside of our own country, which I think 100%. Is unacceptable. And so your website again is www.ChineseCommunistDetention.com, correct?
That's correct. Yep.
Correct. Okay, great. And excellent book and very timely, very well written. There's a lot more information in there, guys. You can learn about all the techniques they're using on people in detention. And Steve Schaerer was lucky to get out. Again, the title of the book is Surviving Chinese Communist Detention by Steven Schaerer. Thanks, Steven.
100%. Thank you very much.
All right, take care. All right, stay there.